A nurse's whisper can travel further than a scream. I found that out at 6:47 in the evening, standing 3 feet from a supply closet at Franklin Park Medical Center, listening to 2 women in scrubs talk about a surgery that, according to them, had never been scheduled in the first place. She's not on Dr. Patterson's list. She was never on anybody's list. That sentence rearranged my entire skeleton. 2 hours earlier, I'd been holding my wife's hand, telling her I'd see her on the other side of an operation the hospital said was her only shot. I'd kissed her forehead. I'd told her I loved her more than the day I married her, which was true, and walked out of that room with my chest caving in like a tin can left out in the rain. Now I was standing in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, finding out the operation I'd just said goodbye over might not exist. My name is Kobe Brown. I'm 44. I manage construction projects for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio, and up until that Thursday evening, I would have told you my biggest problem was keeping subcontractors on schedule. I would have been wrong. My biggest problem was about to introduce herself, and she'd been sitting at my dinner table for over a year, wearing my trust like a borrowed coat. But let me back up to the morning, because the details matter here. They matter more than you'd think. It was Thursday, March 12th. I remember the date because it was printed on the consent form I'd signed 3 days earlier. And because Laura had circled it on the kitchen calendar, in red marker with a little heart next to it, like it was a hopeful date instead of a terrifying one. Laura is 41. She teaches 3rd grade at a school 12 minutes from our house in the Clintonville neighborhood, and she has this laugh that starts in her shoulders before it ever reaches her mouth. 11 weeks earlier, she'd gone in for what we thought was a routine follow-up on some abdominal pain, and instead we got handed a folder full of words I didn't understand, and a referral to a specialist I'd never heard of. I didn't know it yet, but that referral letter was the first lie. The diagnosis, as it was explained to us, was a mass on her pancreas that had progressed past the point where surgery alone could help. Inoperable, the referral said. Terminal without aggressive intervention we likely couldn't access in time. I remember sitting in that consultation room, holding Laura's hand so tight my knuckles went white, while a doctor I'd never met before that day told us, in the gentlest voice I have ever heard a stranger use, that we were looking at months, not years. I want to tell you I handled it with grace. I didn't. I went out to the parking garage and put my fist through the side mirror of my own truck, then sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes with my hand bleeding, trying to figure out how I was supposed to walk back inside and be strong for the woman I'd promised to grow old with. The one person who held me together through those 11 weeks was Laura's older sister, Carol Baker. Carol is 47, and she works as a hospital administrator, not at Franklin Park, where Laura was being treated, but across town at a different facility. A hospital administrator in the family, right when we needed one, I used to think. Carol knew which forms to file, which specialists actually returned calls, which insurance representatives could be reasoned with. She showed up at our house with casseroles and stayed late helping me understand paperwork that read like a foreign language. She texted me every single morning, thinking of you both today, and every single night, how'd it go? Call me if you need anything. I was grateful for her. God, I was grateful. I had no idea that gratitude was exactly what she was farming. If I'd known what those late-night texts actually meant, I would have read every single one of them differently. But hindsight is the cruelest editor there is. The surgery, the one we'd been told was our last real option, a long-shot procedure to remove what they could and buy Laura time for further treatment, was scheduled, supposedly, for that Thursday afternoon. I drove her to Franklin Park before the sun fully cleared the rooftops on our street, both of us quiet, because what do you say on a morning like that? Laura looked over at one point and said, "If anything happens in there, I need you to know I don't regret a single year of this." I told her nothing was going to happen, because that's what you say, even when you don't know if it's true. We checked in. A nurse took her back for prep around 10 in the morning. I sat in a waiting room that had seen better decades, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since the previous presidential administration, waiting for someone to come tell me it was time to say goodbye. Carol showed up around noon, settling into the chair next to me. Her hand finding my shoulder in that way she'd started doing over the past few months, a touch that lingered, maybe half a second longer than a sister-in-law's touch should. I didn't notice it then. I want to be honest about that. I was too gutted to notice anything. How's she doing? Scared, I told her. We both are. She's strong. Carol's hand stayed on my shoulder. And you've been so strong for her, Kobe. I don't know many men who could have held it together the way you have. I thanked her. I meant it. I had no reason not to. Around 4 in the afternoon, a nurse came and got me, and I was walked back to a small pre-op room where Laura was lying under a thin blanket, an IV taped to the back of her hand, looking smaller than I had ever seen her look in 19 years of marriage. I held her face in both my hands and told her I loved her. She told me to make sure I fed the dog properly while she was in recovery, because apparently even on the edge of major surgery, my wife was still worried about whether I'd remember to measure out the kibble correctly. That's exactly who she is. I kissed her forehead. I told her I'd see her soon. Then a nurse gently put a hand on my arm and told me it was time to wait outside, because they needed to start prepping her for transport to the operating room. I walked out into the hallway with my eyes burning, and that's when it happened. That's the moment everything cracked open. 2 nurses were standing near a supply closet maybe 15 feet down the corridor, half turned away from me, voices low but not low enough. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose. Grief makes you stand very still sometimes, and stillness makes you hear things you were never meant to hear. I'm telling you, she's not on Dr. Patterson's surgical list today. The first nurse's voice carried a flat, certain edge. I pulled the OR schedule myself an hour ago. That can't be right. The second nurse's tone sharpened with disbelief. Her husband's been told all day they're prepping her. She's not on it. I don't know what's going on, but somebody needs to check this before that family walks any further down this hallway. The hallway tilted. I'm not being dramatic when I say that. The actual physical hallway tilted like the floor had decided gravity was optional for a few seconds. I put my hand against the wall to steady myself, and one of the nurses turned and saw me standing there, her face going the particular shade of pale that tells you someone has just realized you heard everything you weren't supposed to hear. She's not on Dr. Patterson's list. She was never on anybody's list. I had just told my wife I'd see her soon. I had just kissed her forehead and walked away believing she was being prepped for a surgery that, according to 2 nurses standing 15 feet from me, did not exist. Sir, the nurse's voice went careful, the way you talk to someone standing on a ledge. Can I get you to sit down for a moment? I did not sit down. I asked her, in a voice that didn't sound like mine, what she meant. She hesitated, glanced at her colleague, and said she needed to verify some information before she could say anything further, and could I please wait right there while she found someone from administration. Administration. The word landed in my chest like a stone dropped down a well. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. My wife somewhere behind a set of doors believing she was minutes from surgery, while somewhere in this building, paperwork apparently told a very different story. My hands were shaking. I stared at the fluorescent light fixture above me, counting the tubes inside it, because counting things was the only way I knew how to keep my mind from sprinting somewhere I wasn't ready to go. If I'd known then what I'd learn over the next 4 days, I might have walked straight into that operating prep area and stopped everything right then. But I didn't know yet. I only knew something was wrong, and I had absolutely no idea how deep it went, or whose name was going to end up at the center of it. A man in a gray suit appeared at the end of the hallway, moving with the particular brisk walk of someone who has just been told there's a problem and needs to look like he's already solving it. He introduced himself as part of the hospital's patient relations team and asked me to step into a private consultation room. I asked him one question before I'd take a single step. Is my wife having surgery today or not? He didn't answer right away. And in the silence that followed, I understood that whatever was happening here, it was so much bigger than a scheduling mix-up. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The private consultation room had a box of tissues on the table, which I've come to understand is hospital code for brace yourself. The patient relations man, his name tag said Greg, explained, slowly and carefully, that there had been what he called a documentation discrepancy regarding my wife's surgical scheduling, and that the hospital's chief administrator, Ryan Fisher, was already looking into it personally. What does that mean? I kept my voice as steady as I could manage. In plain English, it means the surgical order in your wife's chart doesn't match what was communicated to your family. We're working to understand the full picture right now. I asked him point blank whether my wife was dying, whether the diagnosis itself was real, or whether that was part of whatever discrepancy he was dancing around. He told me he didn't have access to her full clinical history, but that Fisher would meet with me as soon as possible. I sat in that room alone for 25 minutes. I texted Carol, "Something's wrong. They're saying the surgery wasn't scheduled," and she called me back within 90 seconds, voice tight and urgent, asking me what exactly the nurses had said, word for word. I found that strange even in the moment, though I didn't have the bandwidth to examine why. Most people, hearing news like that, ask is she okay first. I filed that away without understanding what I was filing. I wouldn't understand it for 3 more days. Ryan Fisher walked in around 6:30 that evening. He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and told me that based on what his team had found so far, my wife's name had never appeared on Dr. Patterson's actual surgical docket, not that day, not any day in the past 3 weeks. Then what was I told? I asked. What surgery were we preparing for this entire morning? We're still tracing the chain of communication. Fisher's voice stayed level, deliberate. What I can tell you is that the referral letter that initially diagnosed your wife's condition as inoperable came from outside our system. It wasn't generated by anyone on our staff. The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear a cart being wheeled across linoleum, the wheels squeaking in a rhythm I would remember for the rest of my life. Because it was the sound playing underneath the sentence that broke my entire understanding of the past 11 weeks open like an egg. Outside your system, I repeated. Meaning what? Meaning someone faked it? Meaning we need to determine where that referral originated and whether the clinical picture it describes is even accurate. I don't want to speculate further until we have answers, Mr. Brown. I asked him the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Is my wife actually dying? Fisher held my eyes for a long second. I genuinely don't know yet, and I think that's the most honest thing I can tell you right now. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it. For 11 weeks, I had grieved a woman who was still breathing in a room 40 feet away from me. I had cried in the shower so she wouldn't hear me. And now a hospital administrator was sitting across from me telling me he didn't actually know if any of it had been true. Somebody had handed me 11 weeks of the worst grief of my life, and I was about to find out it might have been manufactured by someone I trusted with my whole heart. They let me see Laura that night. She was groggy from the sedation they'd already started before the discrepancy was caught, confused about why the surgery hadn't happened. I held her hand and told her it had been postponed because the hospital needed to verify some information. And I watched her face do the math, watched her realize I wasn't telling her the whole truth, and watched her decide, out of exhaustion or trust or both, not to push. I didn't sleep that night. I sat beside her hospital bed, scrolling back through 11 weeks of text messages from Carol, reading them with new eyes for the first time. Thinking of you both today. How'd it go? Call me if you need anything. I don't know what you two would do without me. I read that last line maybe 15 times before the sun came up, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, a question formed in my chest I was almost too afraid to finish thinking. What if the 11 weeks of grief I'd been drowning in weren't a tragedy that happened to us? What if they were something somebody did to us? I didn't have proof yet. What I had was a referral letter that came from outside the system, a sister-in-law who'd been suspiciously perfect through every step of this, and a hospital administrator who'd admitted he didn't know if my wife was actually dying. I made a decision sitting in that chair, watching my wife's chest rise and fall under fluorescent light. I wasn't going to ask Carol a single question yet, because if I was right about what I was starting to suspect, the only way I'd ever get the full truth was to let her keep believing I had no idea at all. She thought she'd built something. She had no idea I was about to start tearing it apart, one quiet thread at a time. By Friday morning, I had exactly one plan, and it wasn't a good one. It was the only one I had. I needed someone inside the medical world who actually had my wife's interests at heart, with zero connection to whatever web had been spun around her diagnosis. There was exactly one person who fit: Dr. Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer and Laura had trained together years ago, back before Laura switched career paths from nursing to teaching, and Jennifer had gone on to become an oncologist across the state line in Cincinnati. I called her Friday morning from my truck in the Franklin Park parking garage, hands still shaking from a night with no sleep, and told her everything: the referral, the surgery that wasn't scheduled, Fisher's admission that he didn't know if Laura was actually terminal. Jennifer went quiet for a moment, then the sentence that changed the direction of my week came through, calm and immediate. "Kobe, send me everything you have, every page. Today, if you can get it." I drove home, scanned every document from the past 11 weeks, and emailed the entire stack to Jennifer before noon. Then I did something I'm not proud of, but I'd do it again in a heartbeat. I called Carol and told her I needed help getting copies of Laura's full chart, framing it as wanting a second opinion just to be thorough. I watched her hesitate half a second too long before agreeing. That half second told me more than a full confession would have. Saturday, Jennifer called back. "Kobe." Her voice carried the controlled, professional anger doctors get when they realize a patient has been failed. "I've gone through every page of this twice. The mass on Laura's pancreas is real. The location and the size are real. But it is absolutely, unambiguously operable. This is not a terminal diagnosis. This is a tumor with a strong surgical prognosis if it's removed in the next several weeks. Whoever wrote inoperable on this referral either made a catastrophic error or they lied." I had to pull my truck over on Olentangy River Road, hazard lights blinking, traffic passing, trying to process that the 11 worst weeks of my life had been built on a sentence that wasn't true. Who issued the original referral? Whose name is on it? "That's the strange part," Jennifer said. "It's not signed by anyone at Franklin Park. It's on letterhead from a facility across town. And Kobe," I looked up the administrator listed as having processed the paperwork. "It's Carol Baker." I didn't say anything for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't surprise. Some part of me had already known since 4 in the morning, sitting in that hospital chair. What I felt was the particular, specific horror of watching a suspicion become a fact, in real time, on a road I'd driven 1,000 times. Sunday I didn't confront anyone. A lot of people would have stormed into Carol's house Saturday night demanding answers. But Carol worked in hospital administration. She knew exactly how to make a paper trail disappear, exactly which forms could be quietly amended. If I came at her before I had something undeniable, she'd have time to clean it up, and I'd be left with nothing but my word against hers. So instead, I called Ryan Fisher and asked him, calmly, to set up a meeting for Monday morning. Not framed as a confrontation, just framed as the family wants an update on next steps. Then I asked Jennifer if she'd be willing to be physically present at that meeting with Laura's real chart in hand, in case I needed a second medical opinion in the room. She didn't hesitate. "I'll be there at 8. Laura's family. This is exactly what family does. The hardest part of that entire weekend wasn't the planning. It was Sunday evening, when Carol showed up at the house with dinner, sat across from me at my own kitchen table, and asked how I was holding up, her hand reaching across to cover mine. "I don't know what I'd do without you through all this," I told her. Every word of it was true, and every word of it was also bait. And I hated how easily both things lived in my mouth at the same time. "You don't have to do any of this without me." Her voice dropped quiet. "Whatever happens with Laura, Kobe, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens with Laura, not I hope Laura pulls through." Like my wife's survival was a variable in a different equation entirely, one where Carol was solving for herself. I smiled at her and told her that meant a lot to me, and inside my chest, something that had been grieving for 11 weeks finally, quietly, turned into something else. Monday morning, March 16th, I walked into Ryan Fisher's office at 8 o'clock sharp. Jennifer was already there, seated near the window with a folder of Laura's real records on her lap, dressed in the kind of quiet, unshakable professionalism that makes a room sit up straighter. Fisher sat behind his desk looking like a man who hadn't slept much better than I had over the weekend. "Mr. Brown," Fisher folded his hands on the desk. "I want to start by telling you what my team has confirmed since Thursday. Before you do," I held up a hand, "I'd like to ask that we bring Carol Baker into this meeting. She's been so involved in Laura's care, I think she should hear whatever update you have." I watched Fisher's expression flicker, just slightly, like he already had a guess where this was heading. But he agreed, and a staff member was sent to call her. Carol arrived 12 minutes later, slightly breathless, smiling the careful, practiced smile of someone walking into a room she believes she still controls. "What's going on?" she asked, taking the seat beside me. "Is it Laura? Is everything okay?" "That's actually what we're here to find out." I kept my eyes on her. "Dr. Roberts has reviewed Laura's full chart. She has some things to share." Jennifer didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid the original referral letter on Fisher's desk, then laid Laura's actual imaging and pathology reports beside it, and walked through the discrepancy point by point. The tumor's real size, its real location, the surgical viability that the referral letter had flatly contradicted. This patient was never terminal. Jennifer's gaze moved to Carol, level and unflinching. "Someone took a treatable diagnosis and rewrote it into a death sentence. And the paperwork traces back to your administrative login at your facility, Miss Baker." The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical, like the air pressure had changed. Carol's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life, a kind of collapse that started at her eyes and worked its way down. The practiced warmth draining out of her all at once. That's not. She started, and then stopped, because there was nowhere for that sentence to go. "Carol," I kept my voice level, because I'd promised myself I would. "I need you to tell me why." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face shifted from panic into something raw, something that had clearly been sitting under the surface for longer than 11 weeks. "You don't understand what it's been like." Her voice dropped low. "Watching you with her for 19 years, watching how you look at her. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was happy just being close to your family. And then she got sick, and for the first time in my entire life, I thought." She stopped herself, but it was too late. The sentence had already done its damage. "You thought what?" Fisher asked, his voice quiet but firm, the voice of a man making sure this was on record. "I thought maybe, eventually, there'd be a version of this where Kobe needed someone, and I'd already be there." Carol's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I never wanted her to suffer. I told myself if the diagnosis bought time, if it slowed everything down enough, I'd have time to figure out a way to tell you how I felt before everything changed anyway." Before everything changed anyway. My wife's life, reduced to a timeline Carol thought she was entitled to manage. I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief. It was the specific, cold clarity of watching someone you trusted explain, out loud, exactly how little your marriage had meant to them. 19 years. The words came out colder than I expected. 19 years, and you used her diagnosis as a clock you thought you could control. Carol didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. Fisher was already on the phone with hospital security and legal counsel. His voice low and clipped, and I understood that whatever happened next, termination, licensing board referrals, possibly criminal charges for falsifying medical records, was now moving forward without needing another word from me. I stood up. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I need to go tell my wife the truth. I walked out of that office without looking back at Carol once. Laura was awake when I got to her room, sitting up against the pillows with the particular alertness of someone who'd had a full night of real sleep for the first time in weeks, the sedation finally clearing from her system. Morning light was coming through the blinds in thin gold stripes across the blanket, and for a second, before either of us said anything at all, I just stood in the doorway and looked at her, really looked, The way you forget to do when you think you're running out of time with someone. You look like you haven't slept. She reached a hand toward me. Come here. I sat on the edge of her bed and took both her hands in mine, and I didn't know how to start, so I just started. I told her everything. The overheard conversation in the hallway outside the pre-op room, the two nurses by the supply closet, and the sentence that had cracked the floor out from under me. The hours in that consultation room with Greg and his box of tissues. Ryan Fisher admitting, with a kind of honesty that must have cost him something professionally, that he didn't actually know if she was dying. I told her about calling Jennifer, about the documents, about pulling my truck over on Olentangy River Road when the word operable landed in my ear like something out of a different language entirely. And then, because she deserved the whole truth and not a softened version of it, I told her about Carol. I watched my wife's face move through disbelief, then horror, then a grief that had nothing to do with her diagnosis and everything to do with family. She's been at our table every week. Laura's voice cracked. She held my hand in the consultation room. She cried with me. Kobe, I thought. I genuinely thought she was the one person outside of you who actually understood what we were going through. I know. My throat tightened around the words. I held her hand too, this whole time, thinking it meant something completely different than what it actually meant. Laura was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the blanket, her thumb tracing absent circles over my knuckles. 11 weeks. I have been planning my own funeral in my head for 11 weeks. Kobe, I wrote a letter for you to open on our anniversary in case I wasn't here for it. It's in my nightstand drawer at home. Her voice broke clean in half on that last sentence, and I felt something in my own chest tear along with it. You don't need it, I told her, my own voice not much steadier than hers. You're going to be there to read it to me yourself every single year for the next 40 years, and I'm going to make you sit through every embarrassing toast I give at every anniversary dinner from here on out. She laughed, a small, wet, broken sound, and pulled me down so my forehead rested against hers. We sat like that for a long while, the two of us. In a hospital room that suddenly felt less like a place where Laura was dying and more like a place where Laura was, against every odd we'd been falsely told, going to live. The door was slightly ajar, and we both heard footsteps approach, then pause just outside. I caught a glimpse through the gap Carol, standing there, flanked by a hospital security officer, apparently being escorted out of the building after the meeting upstairs, and someone had let her stop for 30 seconds at her sister's door. Whether that was mercy or cruelty, I'm still not sure. Some decisions get made by people 3 rungs up the chain of command, and you don't get a vote. Laura, Carol's voice came through the gap, thick with tears. I am so sorry. I never wanted you to actually. I just got lost somewhere. I don't even recognize what I did. Laura didn't call out. She didn't ask Carol to come in. She just looked at me, tears sliding down her face, and said, loud enough to carry through the doorway, you let me grieve my own life for 11 weeks so you could wait your turn. Then she reached over and gently pushed the door the rest of the way shut herself, the latch clicking with a sound that felt, in that room, like the end of a chapter. Carol didn't say anything else. I heard the footsteps move away down the hall, slower than they'd arrived, and neither of us said a word until the sound of them had completely faded. Do you think she'll go to prison? Laura eventually asked, her head resting against my shoulder. I don't know, I told her honestly. I think that's going to be up to a licensing board and maybe a prosecutor, and I think it's not really mine to carry anymore. I gave Fisher everything. I gave Jennifer everything. From here, it's out of my hands. Good. There was a steel in Laura's voice I'd rarely heard from her in 19 years of marriage. Because I don't have room for her in my head right now. I have a surgery to actually survive. The real surgery happened the following week, on a Thursday that felt almost deliberately symmetrical with the one that started all of this, performed by Dr. Patterson with Jennifer observing. I sat in that same waiting room, drinking that same terrible coffee, but this time, the chair across from me stayed empty. The surgery went exactly the way the actual medical evidence said it would. Successful. Clean margins, a recovery timeline measured in weeks, instead of the months we'd been told to mourn in advance. I watched her wake up in recovery, groggy and squinting under the lights, and the first thing she asked me was whether I'd fed the dog. I had. I'd gotten very precise with the kibble by that point, measuring it out like I was dosing medicine, because getting that one small thing right had become the closest thing I had to control. The weeks after were slow. The particular way recovery is always slower than you want, and somehow still faster than you expect, looking back. Laura went from a hospital bed to a recliner in our living room to short walks around the block, leaning on my arm at first and then, by early May, not needing it at all. She's back in her third-grade classroom now, 3 days a week, building toward full-time. She still keeps that letter in the nightstand drawer, not because she thinks she'll need it, but because she wants a record of who she was during the 11 weeks she thought she was running out of time. Carol was terminated from her position within days, referred to the State Medical Licensing Board for falsifying patient documentation, and as of this recording, is facing a pending investigation her attorney has advised her not to discuss publicly. I don't know what happens to her next, and for the first time in my life, I've made peace with not needing to know. Laura's parents still ask about her sometimes at holidays, in the careful, sideways way families ask about the person who isn't allowed at the table anymore, and we answer honestly and then change the subject. What I carry from those 11 weeks isn't really about Carol, in the end. It's about the 11 weeks I spent grieving a woman who was sitting right beside me, breathing, holding my hand. 11 weeks I will never get back, stolen by someone who decided her own loneliness gave her the right to rewrite my wife's death sentence. I think about that hallway sometimes, the squeak of that cartwheel, the way 2 nurses whispering by a supply closet ended up being the only honest thing said to me in 11 entire weeks. I used to think trust was something you build once and then just maintain, like a roof you put on a house and never have to think about again. I don't think that anymore. I think trust is something you have to keep checking, gently the way you'd check a foundation after a storm, not because you expect to find rot, but because the people who matter most to you deserve a house that's actually as solid as you believe it to be. Laura and I renewed our vows this past spring, just the 2 of us, and a justice of the peace in our backyard. Under the oak tree we planted the year we bought our house. No big ceremony, no audience, just 2 people who'd been handed a false ending and decided, together, to write a real one instead. She wore the same earrings she wore at our first wedding. I cried more at the second one than I did at the first, which she still gives me grief about, and which I will defend for the rest of my life. Because the first time I married her, I didn't know yet what it would feel like to almost lose her to a lie. The second time, I knew exactly what I was choosing, and I chose it with my whole chest. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.